Hello and welcome to Do You See What I See? I'm Yolanda Nava. Today's guest is a business leader, educator, and veteran broadcaster. He is Frank Cruz, and has had a dynamic and very exciting and contributive career over his many years, starting out with ABC in Los Angeles as a broadcast journalist back in the day. He's taught at the college and university level. He has started a life insurance company, a television network in Spanish, many enterprises, and continues to do good work. So thank you for joining us today. Welcome, Frank Cruz.
Well, thanks for having me, Yolanda. And usually, I people will ask me, and I'll tell them, I'll give you my life in 45 seconds. I started out as a junior high school teacher, then became a university teacher. Then I went to ABC and NBC. Then I left the English side of television, started a Spanish language station, and ended up with a life insurance company and chairman of the board of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That was 35 seconds right there.
Well, that is an outstanding, and we could go on and on within each of these categories. You and I started in television about the same time, you at ABC and me at NBC, and those were exciting days. I think we're facing many challenges. Of course, we're grieving and praying for the people of Los Angeles whose lives have been turned upside down, and we know that we will raise up once again and be the outstanding city and that we have been all these many centuries
Yeah.
since the founding way back in 1700s. So our prayers are and well wishes are with the city of Los Angeles today. Let's look back on many of the things that were very exciting and ongoing. There was a time of hopefulness back in the 70s and 60s and 70s that we seem to be losing today. We haven't, it's all still there, but give us some reflection on where we were then, what we can learn from that as we move forward.
Uh, I often like to describe myself as someone that was a product of the 1960s, and that's the historian in me. But the 1960s were really a very tumultuous period with an enormous amount of activism, you may recall, and not only from Blacks and Latinos, but Asians and others. Native Americans were very much involved. And it was a dynamic period because you had not only all of that activism, but throw in at least three assassinations that really were key instrumental in the 60s. And that would have been Jack Kennedy, and then Bobby Kennedy, then Martin Luther King. Now, add to that all of the activism of the 60s that brought us under Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society, if you recall. Those were the years where we had uh, we passed the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s. You had the secondary and elementary vote acts in terms of providing funding at that level, higher education. You had Medicare, Medicaid, all created in the 60s. So it was a very active period that produced, and to minorities, it gave us a lot of hope that things were improving and getting better. And I think, you and I were part of that first wave that got into television due to that awakening into that tension and turmoil that was part of the 1960s.
I remember when there was a U.S. Commission on Civil Rights
Right.
report, window dressing on the set, because we were so underrepresented.
Yeah.
And from that time forward, there were efforts, to
Right.
bring the people into broadcast media because radio and television and the media and communications are really critical to a free society.
No, absolutely.
And also the understanding of history. And of course, there were movements to get Chicano history into the colleges and universities and to have
Yeah.
more awareness of the contributions
Right.
of Latinos and various minority groups, which
Right.
has been successful in the past, but we've had a, kind of a turning back, not a kind of, we've had a turning backwards. And it looks like we're going to have to face some challenges again in the coming weeks as things change once again, perhaps requiring that we reactivate a lot of things that we learned in the 60s. What do you think made it possible for us to have such tremendous successes apart from some of the legislation? There was something else going on.
Yeah. Well, I think it was that awareness, and I think the awareness that we wanted equal rights, that we wanted equal education, and that we wanted to be part and parcel of all of the institutions of society. We were pushing for that, and I think those were some of the main themes that permeated all of the activism, women's rights, et cetera, and the pushing for equality in not only politically but educatively and so forth. And one of the end products of it was, of course, the infamous walkouts of East LA of 1968 that was brought on by, and I think that was one of the key lighting factors that I think, from the standpoint of education, it led to creating these Chicano studies departments. And I think there were enough people with masters and already teaching to some extent that subject matter that ultimately led right to departments and creation of Chicano studies departments at the universities, especially at the state universities here in California. And those Chicano studies departments, I think, were, if you will, it bringing in that history that had been hidden, that history that wasn't mentioned, about who we were, what were our achievements, and so forth. And I think it came to the fore. I taught at Chicano Studies up in the Bay Area first, up at Sonoma State. After I left Lincoln High School, I was at Lincoln High School for the walkouts in '68, and then '69 I went up to the Bay Area up there. I was hoping to do my PhD up at Stanford or Cal, but they wanted a full-time day student, and here I was, a married man with a child, and I needed to work part-time. So I immediately left the Bay Area and came back down to Long Beach State University, but I was chairman of Chicano Studies at Long Beach State. But the beauty of it was that we could teach in those history courses, all of the positive attributes and all of the real reason behind the Mexican War, that it was a fabricated entity, that was used to acquire the expansion of colonialism by Americans to go all the way to the Pacific coast, and to bring out that kind of history, as well as a lot of other positive themes and topics.
It was a very exciting time. I had a stint as a community college teacher instructor when I was a grad student at UCLA.
Right.
And of course, I had taken a couple of Chicano studies classes there, but my degree was in U.S. history, which I'm glad I did it that way because I know a lot more than I would have known otherwise. And I can integrate the two histories, very, very easily. But I taught over at Santa Monica Community College, and I was just a couple of years older than the students that were in community college because myself, I was still a graduate student. And I would give them the same kind of materials to read that I had at UCLA, and these poor kids were inundated. I was just throwing at them right and left, trying to pack them in. And a couple of my students later became elected officials in Santa Monica and really became contributive people and activists. It was quite exciting.
Yeah.
Those were great days with a lot of hope. They also shaped a lot of the there were parallels with what's going on today, because at that time when Comisión Femenil was first getting started, and Gloria Molina, Supervisor Molina, who unfortunately is deceased now, and I were a couple of the first members that founder member Francisca Flores pulled in with a group of veteran women political activists and pioneers in the city of Los Angeles who had done a lot of work and were about to join at that time, the new Bradley administration, Tom Bradley administration. which was very exciting because we had
Mhm.
members of our group that were going to be represented in the new mayor's office, the first Black mayor in Los
Right.
Angeles. And it was interesting because uh, our first, one of our first achievements was the lawsuit, the anti-sterilization lawsuit, because LA County Hospital was sterilizing Mexican and Mexican American women without their knowledge or consent.
That's right.
So, and now we're looking at periods of time where it's so crazy and turned
Mhm.
upside down because now we're having to fight for our right to birth control, which was removed recently by the Supreme Court, with women's rights being reversed significantly
Right.
after 50 years of tremendous forward movement. So these patterns seem to be cyclical in
Yeah.
some way.
Uh, they are cyclical in a sense, but what I think I like to classify them as reactionary movements. In other words, wanting to stop that or wanting it not to advance any further. I have, Yolanda, I have had serious discussions with people over the years here who I would consider as knowledgeable folks who are educated who will look at me and say, Mr. Cruz, now when is it that your people are supposed to be the dominant culture in this country? Or, and I genuinely feel that there is a reaction to all of that growth that we had and the way we're moving into different aspects of society in a positive fashion. And I think there's a genuine fear by a lot of folks that this will be by 2040, 2050, a multicultural society where whites will not be the dominant factor. And I think it concerns a lot of people. And I think you're witnessing some of that in the opposition that is growing by major corporations and others to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They don't like it, and they are abandoning it. And but I think, as I indicated to you here recently, the challenge I think for this generation of Latinos and Latinas that are educated and moving up the chain of command will be to make sure that we can get into these boards and into these suites as leaders, as CEOs, as chairmen, as members of boards. Right now, I mean, you look at any major corporation, look at the board, it's predominantly white male. And that I think those will be the challenge. We've gotten to a certain extent where we're at least encouraging or pushing our kids to get educated. I've got three kids. My oldest daughter is a lawyer in New York. She's the managing director, managing partner of a big law firm in the United States. And then I have another daughter who's a dentist and a son who's a lawyer. I push the holy daylights, but they're all there. But I tell them, hey, kids, I want to see you up at the C suites. I want you leading. I want you to be CEOs. And I think there's fight back to that or resistance to that. But I think this is the challenge that my kids and your kids will be facing in the future.
Well, the predictions were back in the 80s. Remember, that was to be
Yeah,
the decade of the Hispanic,
right.
and that didn't happen. And it was a prognosis that the population would be growing. And it's strange because the population, while it's been demeaned and attacked with hatred and vitriol, since 2015, it's the opposite that's the truth. We are nearly a $4 trillion market in this nation, and that is a lot of frijoles to be
Yeah,
contributing. And don't get back the taxes
yeah,
necessarily because many of those people are
right,
undocumented and
right.
earning wages. It's very disturbing to see the backwards movement, the removal of women's rights to control their own body, make their own decisions, is anathema to everything that's happened, at least since the
Yeah,
60s and the 70s. And we have to, how do we get these young people to attune to history and let them understand it and know how they're going to engage, because it's their turn.
right.
We're going to be phasing out of here maybe in another 10 or 20 years. So they've got to do it.
Yeah, that's true. And I think if they are taking or have taken courses somewhere along the line pertaining to Chicano history and so forth, hopefully that will help in giving them that enlightenment. But I think many of them are very bright and they can see that there is a certain point at how high they can rise within a corporation. And it'll be up to them to beat the doors down, put their foot in and say, hey, I'm going to be in this C-suite. I'm going to be the executive. I'm going to be the chair of this or the chair of that. And I think that's the attitude that many of them have to take in order, to get past these hurdles that are popping up now that I think are, rearing their ugly heads to prevent us from that upward mobility.
Well, the upward mobility will not be stopped because people are here
Yeah,
and the qualities, the capabilities are very strong. The
right.
culture retains its virtues to a
Yeah,
large extent when you go back a couple of generations and people get that thinking of upward mobility, of goodness, of mildness, of kindness, of responsibility, of humility, of respect, all of these virtues that help one live a
right.
quality life and can help maintain a sane society. The interesting thing is uh, the downturn in learning about government and history. I understand recently hearing that many schools do not require U.S. government to
Right.
graduate from high school. I can't understand that. That to me is
Yeah,
unbelievable. It's an elective.
yeah. Yeah. Uh, Part of that resistance that we were talking about to the growing numbers and those that are concerned about the massive numbers of Latinos and so forth, and that the people of color will wind up being the majority. Part of it, of their resistance, is manifesting itself in banning books and in not including it into the curriculum and so forth. I remember when I was teaching at Lincoln High School, you teach history at the 8th and the 11th grade. I was teaching 11th graders, and there's some very good textbooks, but you get to the textbook chapter on immigration. They talked about Jewish, Italian, Irish, German, and I said, my God, I looked at the kids in my class. 99.9% looked like me, and they were Cruzes and Gonzalez and Chavez and Navas. And I said, there's nothing there pertaining to their immigration. How did their parents arrive? Where did they come from? Were they from Chihuahua, Sinaloa, Sonora, Chiapas, or where? And there weren't any textbooks. And a lady who's been a mentor to many of us, to Gloria Molina, to Antonia Hernandez, to myself and others, Dr. Helen Miller Bailey at East LA College. I went to Dr. Bailey and I said, Doc, I says, is there a book or something that we could that I could use to enlighten these kids on Mexican immigration? And she said, there is none. And then in her daring way that she was, pushing you to the max, she said, Mr. Cruz, let's write one. So we co-authored one. And I included a whole chapter in there about how mineros and agricultural workers and railroad workers all came into the Southwest. And that's how, we were here before, but we settled in a major area. But it goes to your point, Yolanda, that the history books are shy of that, although I'm I'm optimistic because there's some good work that's coming out. Laura Gomez over at UCLA is writing some very good stuff on ethnicity and on Mexican American issues. Natalia Molina is another one that is writing. Carlos Parra is another one who is doing some great work. In bringing Chicano studies and Chicano history to the forefront. But you're right, it's running into resistance by school boards and school districts, and they don't want to learn that. They don't want to say that. It's a concern that they're going to look negative. But I think that's the racism that we've had to face for these many years.
Well, it's a matter of opening things up again. I mean, intelligent people who have studied history know the truth about the Mexican and the Latino communities. And one of the advantages, you mentioned Lyndon Johnson, who championed so many positive things during his
Right.
time. It's a pity that the Vietnam War took him down.
Yeah.
But that was a mistake, but we didn't know that at the time.
Right.
But the the importance of understanding how and where people come from
Yeah.
and the challenges that they faced, and that the virtues and the values of the people of Latin America are
Yeah.
congruent with our own. They
Right.
had got the same messages of the Enlightenment that we did here in the United States. And so I don't know what this great fear is, although I guess fear has always been implanted in
Yeah.
order to create obstruction.
Right. That's true. And you know, it is, you know, I often ask kids, as when I was teaching, I says, can you name me two or three outstanding Hispanic leaders?
Mhm.
I says, you know, aside from Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and they'll think they can't get it. I says, can you name me two or three? And then I tell them, how many of you have heard of Elena Ochoa?
Mhm.
Says, she was the first U.S. Latina astronaut. NASA and had missions into outer space. She's a heck of a hero. Have you ever heard of Mario Molina? I said, no, Mario Molina identified all of the chemicals that we are using in this society and in our world to pollute the ozone level. And
Wow.
then I tell them, have you ever heard of Guillermo Gonzalez Camarena? And they say, no, Guillermo Gonzalez Camarena. I said, when you go home tonight and watch TV and you see a color TV, that's the Mexican at the age of 24 who discovered how to put a light through a tube and break the colors up into it so you can have color. It's the father of television. But
Well,
nobody teaches it.
I remember when the first Mexican American astronaut Juan Hernandez
Right. Yeah.
went up into space,
Yeah.
and his story is amazing because he
Yeah.
had to buck years and years of resistance from the
Yeah.
higher up,
Yeah.
and he finally got his shot, and was the first. And these are great stories to empower young
Right.
people, and they need to hear them. They
Right.
need to see their own, in positive ways,
Right.
and which is why it's so important to have greater communications and media coverage and inclusion all across the board. You
Right.
served on the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Talk a bit about the importance of, uh, well, truth in media and protecting media from manipulation
Yeah.
by financial and other interests.
Yeah. That, by the way, was another creation of the 1960s.
Mhm.
The the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. And I sound like a broken record on the 60s, but I'm a product
They're
of that.
great.
But that's what gave us all of the impetus. But along with all of the other acts and civil rights acts and voting rights act, the Public Broadcasting Act was passed for a variety of reasons. It created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and then that ultimately then led to the creation of PBS that most people know, 365 some odd PBS stations in America, and then over 700 NPR or National Public Radio stations. So it's a network. And I was fortunate to be nominated and sit on that board for almost 13 years. President Clinton nominated me and appointed me to that board. But it's important because it really attempts to give you a balance of news and the coverage. It's not all one theme oriented or one side or another. So it's a good balance in that kind of a context. But it was created because I think individuals were concerned that commercial television was, in a sense, either too sensationalistic or too much to one direction, and they wanted a safe haven for good, clean broadcasting and so forth. And when I got on it, and I became the chairman of it, I became the first minority person ever to head public broadcasting, that network of over 1,100 public radio and television stations. But I have to tell you a story. I'm sitting here at home one morning, having my cup of coffee, listening to the news, and all of a sudden I heard a report that CBS, Les Moonves, who was the president at the time, And I knew Les from a previous board that President Clinton had nominated us to, and we served together. So I knew Les. And the story that morning from CBS New York was that they had settled on the schedule for CBS television for the fall season, and that it was going to be a year of dramas. Okay, so one of the dramas was called American Family, and it was produced by Gregory Nava, and but it didn't make the cut for CBS nationwide. So I picked up the phone and I called uh, Les, and I said, Les, I said, is there? Why didn't you guys pick that American Family? Would have been a great one. Gregory Nava was producing it. I said, and he's having Raquel Welch on there. He was going to have Eddie Olmos, and on and on. And he said, Frank, I don't know. He said some guy in New York in the programming department decided that they wanted other dramas and not that one. So long story short, Yolanda, I said to him, let's, because I was chairman of the board of CPB at the time. I said, may we have it? Can we work with it? And he said, Frank, you can have it. Just give us credit for the first show that you air. I immediately picked up the phone and called my president of CPB, Bob Coonrod was his name, and I told him what we had. And then we talked to Pat Mitchell, who was head of PBS, and I said, this is the first American drama on television, commercial or public, American Family, and it got on the air and it was produced. Now, Yolanda, I have to tell you, had it not been for a Mexican American sitting on that CPB board as chair, it would never have seen the light of day. Scholastic also produces a lot of shows for public broadcasting, Clifford the Red Dog and Sesame Street and on and on. And Scholastic called me one day and they said, oh, Mr. Cruz, we think we've got an idea on a bilingual cartoon series for kids. And I said, oh, really? Well, it ultimately led to Maya and Miguel. But the point being here, had there not been a Latino on that board at the time, those would never have seen the light of day. That's why I hearken to people and tell them we've got to get into those decision-making positions.
Well, they're vital. Yeah. I interviewed Herman Gallegos, who is now well into his 90s, and he was the founder of Hispanics in Philanthropy, and he served on a number of major boards and traveled all over the world, with these foundations. And what he was telling me in our interview, and we had one 2 years ago, he was my first actually interview when I started doing in 2022, when I started doing the series of Do You See What I See? And he was saying that the foundation, the major foundations that influence everything around the world give only about 3% to Latino-oriented projects.
Right.
So he says we really have to ramp up our presence and how we are able to receive funds from these foundations that are life-changing, world-changing. So that is an area that people have to move into, like you say, move into decision-making positions. And I think we have to start strategically thinking beyond corporate positions, but to these major foundation boards who influence everything that goes on around the world.
Right. One of them is in California, the Irvine Foundation, which is huge. $8 billion foundation, gives out over, depending on how the market is doing and the amount of funds that we get, over 200 million to programming in California, not program, but projects. And doesn't I don't necessarily mean radio or TV programming, but projects across the state. I don't mind telling you, I was on the board of the Irvine Foundation, thanks to a lady by the name of Mary Bitterman, who had been with public broadcasting and had a keen eye for diversity and inclusion. Mary Bitterman became the head of the Irvine Foundation around 2000. I was still on the board of CPB, and she asked me to join the Irvine Foundation. Well, the Irvine Foundation made its money here off of properties in Southern California that the Irvine family, going back to the 1860s and 70s, after the Mexican War, territories and areas to gobble up, huge properties that they own. But the foundation was headquartered in San Francisco, because that's where the banks were, but all of the funding stayed within the Bay Area. So Mary's perspective was, let me get some minorities on this board, get some women on this board, and let's spread it out so we don't just fund Northern California, we fund Southern California. But you got to be on those boards and on those positions to bring about that change. And that's where we find ourselves at that particular cusp right now.
Well, this is critical, and it's good critical thinking in terms of meetings and strategies that are being held and will continue to be held to help shape a positive future for everyone,
right?
Which should be our objective and goal individually as well as a nation. And we've been there in the past, and we certainly can do it again, in the present and in the future. But it takes these connections, and it takes this talking to one another and supporting one another. Certainly, once we get someplace, that opens doors, and that's been a wonderful experience to be in places where that, where that has happened, and there are these possibilities that expand. But it is a question of knowing who's who, and really pushing each other forward.
Yeah, that's true. And that it really takes that concerted effort, because I think once you start moving up those chains of commands and get into those, you begin to see how they work and how they operate. And it's like you and I, when we were in our television days in our youth with CBS, you and I with ABC and NBC, people don't understand what you have to go through to get a story on the air. You have to have an assignment desk. You have to have producers that are sensitive to and of course, letting you and I into those positions was one thing. But the thing is, how do we cover those stories then? I remember when I first started out at Channel 7 and covering community stories, I mean, there were camera crews that didn't want to go out with me and say, Frank, oh God, there he is, that bleeding angel for bleeding heart for all these Mexican issues in East LA. Or they tell me, hey, our audience is West LA, not East LA. So I'm watching East LA. I would say, I told them, stand on the corner of Atlantic and Whittier Boulevard. And do me a favor, I tell them, drive south on Atlantic Boulevard as you're headed towards the ocean, towards Long Beach. And I said, you're going to run into Commerce, Vernon, Maywood, Bell, Bell Gardens, Huntington Park, Southgate, all the way. I said, those used to be poor white neighborhoods in the Depression years of the 1930s when people moved out here. And then I said, then they made a transition to Black. I said, from 1965 on, I said, they have all been heavily Hispanic communities. In fact, when we were starting KVEA and Telemundo, I used to take the individuals that were thinking about funding us, and I'd get them in a car and I'd make that drive on Atlantic, and I'd said, and they would look around. They say, my God, this is like being in a third world in Latin America. And I said, you're right. I said, but that's of course, I'm referring to the Immigration Act of 65 that also came under Lyndon Johnson, that opened the doors. Before that, it was a quota system of Irish, British, and German ancestry, and 65 ended it to a system where there were needs around the world to bring in people, like the Cuban crisis and so forth, brought in, and they opened it up. But it opened it up to Latin America, and as I was telling you the other day, you can see the 60 census, 70 census, 1980, 1990, and that's where the numbers really were growing, and you can see what.
Well, the numbers are growing and the contributions have been growing, which has not been appreciated. And in fact, with this, the threats to round up and deport immigrants, especially from, Mexico and Latin America, the farmers and other major service industries are saying, no, we have to have exemptions, because they say over 1 million of the people that are providing the food on our tables are immigrants without documentation.
Yeah.
And there's no program. There used to be an amnesty program. I used to cover AIDS and amnesty in the 80s. And And there was an amnesty program that was very effective in transitioning people and bringing
Yeah.
people in legally. And then there's been no
Yeah.
legislation since the mid
Yeah.
1900s, 1990s, which is why we're having, difficulties
Right.
today.
Yeah.
But all of that is very important to renew and restore because you can't shut it off.
That's
You
true.
literally will crash our economy. And
That's
the
true.
farmers and some of these other large industries are starting to
Yeah.
complain to the
Yeah.
new president that's coming
Yeah.
in that
Right.
it could be a disaster, a catastrophe.
Did I lose you? Yeah.
We dropped it. We dropped
Your
audio.
voice.
We dropped audio.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we're okay. Did we're getting close to the 40 minutes.
Okay.
I
Well,
don't know.
I want to just say, any closing statements before we close out today? Anything else that we missed that you want to point you want to get across that's important to you?
No, I mean, other than the fact that I think these kinds of what you're doing, I think is extremely important to further that cause and that overture. All I know is that we have to be vigilant because I'm not sure what kind of onerous plans will emerge out of the White House next week when the president takes over. We have certainly in the past seen in the 1930s deportations, and again in the 50s with Operation Wetback. So if they start rounduping, making roundups of individuals, that's going to be, a difficult period. I'm just hoping that there are enough individuals of goodwill in America, enough judges, enough attorney generals who will put up blocks or put up hurdles or try to stifle things that are extremely onerous, especially pertaining to Latinos in this country.
Well, we will see the good coming in, and we will see that progress has to continue forward and that the contributions of Latinos and others will be appreciated because, again, we are soaring economically and we're achieving
Yeah.
great heights and we're going to continue to do so. I want to thank you so much, Frank Cruz, for joining me today on Do You See What I See?
Yeah.
And to the audience, be sure and tune in again next month for our next edition of Do You See What I See? Thank you for joining us, Yolanda Nava.